Welcome back. I'm Brie Rosalie, and this is You've Heard It Said, where faith meets history and the stories we thought we knew come alive. We've reached the final episode of the Egypt in the Bible series. We started in January with the Egypt in Your Head, the flannel board version of what we all grew up with. In over 8 episodes, we walked through the Nile and Egypt's economy, their gods and their obsession with cosmic order, the women who resisted from the margins, Joseph's costly assimilation, the politics of a new pharaoh who did not know Joseph, and Moses, who had to be unmade as a prince before he could be remade into a deliverer. And now we land here. The story doesn't end with Israel walking out of Egypt. Egypt keeps showing up in the prophets, in a refugee family fleeing a different murderous king, in some of the oldest Christian communities on earth. So today we're going to talk about what it means that Egypt, once the house of slavery, became, of all things, holy ground. Okay, let's get into it. You can still visit Egypt and see the Karnak temple right where it's always been. The pyramids were already ancient when Moses was born, and you can put your hand on a column that has stood for 4,000 years. I did when I was in Egypt. The civilization that obsessed over permanence pulled it off, physically at least. Their stones are still there. But the Egypt those stones were built to immortalize? Gone. Nobody speaks the language Pharaoh and his vizier spoke. Meanwhile, a much smaller, downtrodden, marginalized, conquered people on the edge of Egypt's empire are still telling the story of getting out. Every Passover, every Easter, every time someone opens Exodus 1. So here's the question we've been building toward over this series. How does memory outlast monument? And why does Egypt, this one specific empire, never really stop showing up in the Bible and beyond? Here's something the Sunday school coloring sheets omit. Egypt, Pharaoh's Egypt, the one that drowned Hebrew baby boys in the Nile and chased Israel into the sea, was conquered. Repeatedly. Over 1,500 years, Cushites, Assyrians, Persians, Greeks, Romans, and finally Arabs each took their turn ruling, and each one reshaped Egypt's language, religion, and names. The empire that built monuments meant to outlast time spent the next 1,500 years getting layered over. And you can see that layering, physically, in the very stones. Every sacred site in Egypt is a palimpsest, a manuscript where someone scraped off the old writing and wrote over it, but you can still see the earlier text underneath. That's what the temples are. Every one that I walked through had been claimed, unclaimed, reclaimed, and claimed again by hands that didn't build them. It started with the Egyptians themselves. Erasure was native to the system. Later pharaohs scratched out earlier pharaohs and added their own names, taking credit for monuments they didn't actually build. Thutmose III did this with his aunt Hatshepsut, trying to chisel her out of the royal record. Akhenaten tried to wipe out every god except the sun disk god, Aten. His son, Tutankhamun, under the watchful eye of the high priest, undid his father's monotheistic revolution. The instinct to overwrite was already there before any foreigner showed up. Then the Ptolemies arrived, Greek-speaking Macedonians who could have imposed Greek temples on the country, instead started building Egyptian-style temples and putting themselves on the walls in pharaoh costume, letting the priests deify them. There's a relief at the Temple of Luxor where Alexandria the Great is depicted as pharaoh, in the crown and the kilt, making offerings to Amun, a Macedonian kid rebranded as an Egyptian god king on walls older than his civilization. The Romans did the same thing when they took over from the Ptolemies. Emperors on Egyptian temple walls performing the rituals of pharaohs, because if you wanted to rule Egypt, you had to perform as its god king. Then the Christians arrived. Copts chiseled crosses into temple walls. They defaced the gods. Literally, they cut the faces off the reliefs and turned these ancient sacred spaces into Christian churches. There is an altar and a niche for communion wine inside the temple of Isis at Philae, inside Isis's own temple. They built a Christian sanctuary in one of Egypt's most sacred sites to one of its oldest goddesses. As renovations go, that one is theologically loud. Then the Muslims arrived. There's actually a mosque sitting inside the Temple of Luxor. Not next to it, inside it, built into the upper walls of the ancient Egyptian temple that was long buried below the sand. It's in the Luxor Temple complex. In fact, you can stand in one spot and see 5 religious economies stacked on top of each other. The iconic Avenue of Sphinxes brings you to the feet of 4 larger-than-life granite depictions of Ramses II as the great warrior king he was. The Hypostolic Hall tells of his deeds and tells stories of Egypt's victories all the way into the inner sanctum. But if you look carefully, you can see crude Coptic crosses cut into where the hieroglyphs and images once loudly proclaimed the might of Egypt's gods. If you crane your neck up on the opposite side, you'll see arched doorways and windows inexplicably at the top of the walls. It's a disorienting realization that a structure as grand and expansive as Luxor was once buried beneath the sand to give way for a mosque to be built into the ruined walls. Inside the Holy of Holies, you can spy the relief I described earlier, Alexander the Great as pharaoh, cementing Macedonia's presence to this ancient Egyptian site. And just outside the Holy of Holies, the Romans dismantled the stone blocks for their own decor and frescoes. Some of the stones were carted away for other building projects, or even reassembled upside down and haphazardly. And then everyone else wanted in. Even before the dawn of Egyptology, which had its own complicated history and exploits, explorers came to marvel at the ruins. You can still read the graffitied names of Napoleonic soldiers or Victorian travelers. Somebody's great-granduncle signed a 3,000-year-old wall like a yearbook. Footnote: the instinct to carve your name into something sacred, to prove you were there, to prove this place has you in it now, is apparently universal. End footnote. Within a span of less than 900 feet, thousands of years of faith, belief, and jockeying for significance are stacked beside each other, perhaps to remain like that for the next 1,000 years. If the temples show the layering visually, there's one object that shows it linguistically, and it's not in Egypt anymore. On my way home from Egypt, I actually stopped in London, and in the British Museum, I stood in front of the Rosetta Stone. Now, it's a popular language learning software today, but in case you're unfamiliar with its namesake, let me quickly download the actual artifact's fascinating significance. The Rosetta Stone is a royal decree from Ptolemy V, dated 196 BC, and it's carved in 3 scripts: Egyptian hieroglyphs on top, Egyptian Demotic in the middle, and Greek at the bottom. It needed 3 scripts because by 196 BC, the Ptolemies, their upper-class bureaucrats, and anyone else absorbed into the Ptolemaic Empire from outside spoke Greek. But the vast majority of native Egyptian working class still spoke the Demotic Egyptian language. And the formalized version of their language, the religious and ceremonial language, the hieroglyphs, was maintained by the minority population of priests and scribes. But, as one could predict, the years went by and yet another empire came into power, and the minority preserving the hieroglyphs eventually died out, and the language perished along with them. The hieroglyphs were an archaic mystery for hundreds of years, until the French scholar Jean-François Champollion, and others, but historically he gets the byline here, cracked it in 1822. This dead language was resurrected by a Frenchman in a museum using a stone made for Greek-speaking elites who had already started forgetting the language. Now, as cool as the Rosetta Stone is and how amazing it is that we have access to the ancient world of Egypt through this linguistic breakthrough, it hasn't led to a revitalization of that religious order or the resurgence of pharaonic empires as they once were at their height. Ancient Egypt has remained just that, ancient, steeped in symbolism and lore. Egypt may have built to be remembered, but Israel chose to remember. And look how history turned out. Think about how improbable Israel's story is. They get conquered by Assyria and lose the northern kingdom. They get conquered by Babylon and lose the temple. They get scattered across the ancient world more than once. And through every catastrophe, the story they tell themselves isn't, we are the chosen victors. It's, we were slaves in Egypt and God brought us out. That's a really weird foundational story to keep telling when you think about it. Most empires build origin myths around glory, but Israel has, we were nobodies in a foreign country and God noticed us. And they will not stop telling it. Deuteronomy basically can't get through a chapter without bringing it up. Remember that you were a slave in Egypt when you set the table. Remember when you treat the foreigner. Remember when you rest on the Sabbath. Remember when you celebrate festivals. Remember, remember, remember. Footnote: Passover, the ritual that formalizes this remembering, is over 3,000 years old, and it is still observed in the same month with the same basic gestures, using instructions that are still in the Bible. Most civilizations that existed when the first Passover was celebrated do not exist anymore. End footnote. Here's the structural reason this story survived when Egypt's didn't. Egypt's identity was tied to a place, and that place was the Nile. They erected their monuments and temples, maintained Mot, and raised the pharaoh to the status of a god. All impressive and absolutely fascinating, as I hope this series has shown you, but take away control of that place, or those buildings, and you take away Egypt. Israel's identity was tied to a covenant and a story, and you can carry both into exile. Here's a piece of Egypt's story that I almost never hear taught in Christian church. Egypt didn't just show up at the beginning of Israel's story in the Pentateuch, it kept showing up. Solomon married an Egyptian princess and made Egypt his strategic ally. 1 Kings 3:1. When Solomon's officer Jeroboam fell out of favor, he fled to Egypt for asylum until the king died. 1 Kings 11:40. The prophet Uriah ran to Egypt to escape Jehoiakim's death warrant. Jeremiah 26:1. And in the chaos after Babylon destroyed Jerusalem in 586 BC, a group of Jewish refugees fled south, dragging the prophet Jeremiah with them against his will, and joined Jewish settlements that were already there. Jeremiah 43:44. Long before Mary and Joseph ran to Egypt, and don't worry, we're getting to them, Egypt had been the Hebrew Bible's go-to refuge. There were Jewish soldiers garrisoned at Elephantine in southern Egypt by the 5th century BC, with their own temple to Yahweh. Yes, a Jewish temple in Egypt, which we have the Aramaic letters to prove. By the time of Jesus, Alexandria had what was likely the largest Jewish population of any city outside of Judea. And here's what those Egyptian Jews did that changed everything. They translated the Hebrew Bible into Greek. The translation is called the Septuagint. It happened in stages in Alexandria between roughly 250 and 130 BC. The Jews living in Egypt were Greek speakers by that point. They needed their scripture in a language they actually used. So a translation got made, and once the Septuagint existed, it spread. Footnote: tradition says that Ptolemy II commissioned 72 Jewish scholars who produced miraculously identical translations in 72 days. Most historians treat that dramatic version as a bit polished, a little too neat and tidy to be literal. End footnote. The Septuagint is not just a footnote in church history. It is the Bible the early church used. According to one of my favorite resources for this series, a podcast with biblical archaeologist Amanda Hope Haley, when Jesus and the New Testament writers quote the Old Testament, what they're often quoting is the Septuagint, the Greek translation, not the Hebrew original. Mark 7:6-7, where Jesus quotes Isaiah 29:13, lines up with the Septuagint, not the Hebrew. Many of the Old Testament citations in the New Testament work this way. In fact, the Septuagint became the source for nearly every other ancient Christian translation: Coptic, Ethiopic, Old Latin, and Slavic. It's the text the Greek Orthodox still use as their Old Testament. In other words, every English Bible in print today still carries the footprints of a translation made by Jewish people in Egypt almost 3 centuries before Jesus was born. The land Israel sang about escaping from is the land that gave the church its Bible. Now let's get into the Holy Family in Matthew 2. Herod hears that a king has been born, panics, and then orders the slaughter of every male infant in Bethlehem. Footnote: classic insecure ruler move, right? To stay on theme, we could cue up a callback montage to the hieroglyphics dream sequence in The Prince of Egypt. End footnote. An angel tells Joseph to take the baby and Mary and flee to Egypt. Where exactly the family lived is something scripture doesn't tell us. Matthew only tells us they went to Egypt and they stayed until Herod died. What we can say is that the family was walking into a world that was surprisingly familiar. Mary and Joseph were Galilean Jews. Their first language was almost certainly Aramaic, the everyday language of first century Palestine. They would have heard Hebrew in the synagogue, and they would have known some Greek. You couldn't really avoid it under Roman law. But the Egyptian Jewish communities they were running toward, especially in and around Alexandria, were primarily Greek speaking. Many had stopped reading Hebrew altogether. The synagogues there read the Septuagint. So when the Holy Family arrived in Egypt, they didn't enter a foreign country. They entered a world where Israel's story was already being told, in Greek, by Jewish people who had been there for centuries. A vibrant, fully immersed Jewish diaspora ready to take in another refugee family from up north. When Matthew quotes Hosea, "Out of Egypt I called my son," he reads Hosea forward. Hosea wrote it looking backward at the Exodus, with Israel as God's son being called out of bondage. Matthew sees the pattern repeat. Jesus is the son now. Egypt, once the place of judgment, becomes the place that keeps the Messiah alive long enough for the story to continue. Tradition says that the Holy Family stayed many places in Egypt. One of those is a small cavern in Old Cairo, near where the Roman fortress of Babylon once stood. The Church of the Cave, Abu Serga, was built directly over it. I went down there while I was on my trip, and what struck me was how small it is. Despite the plaques and the guided tours going in and out of the cramped corridors of the church, there's something prosaic about it, especially compared to the staggering grandeur of the Egyptian temples and monuments to their deities. But I suppose that humble cave represents another pattern we've seen a lot in this series. God, time and time again, chooses the unlikely and the unconventional. Egypt, to the surprise of a Moses or Joseph contemporary Hebrew, I'm sure, broke out of its cycle of refuge oppressor. Christianity took root in Egypt and shaped early church history in the most unexpected ways. Tradition says that Mark planted the church in Alexandria around 50 AD. By 325, Athanasius, the bishop of Alexandria, was at the Council of Nicaea defending the full divinity of Christ. The Nicene Creed millions of Christians still recite was largely shaped by an Egyptian, defending the divinity of a refugee child who had once been hidden from a king in a cave near Cairo. That's not Egypt as a villain or as a passive safe harbor. That's Egypt participating in the call of Abraham. God said to Abraham way back in Genesis 12:3, "All people on earth will be blessed through you." I know the Egypt-Israel story is complex, but there's something beautiful in seeing how God uses that complexity to further his mission with every twist and turn of history and the impact of those who decide to participate in his story. Here's what I hope this whole series has done. I hope that when you read Genesis now, you see the hypostolic halls behind Joseph's story. When you read Exodus, I hope you grasp the plagues for what they were, not random disasters, but a theological argument that Yahweh was bigger than the entire cosmic system Pharaoh's throne sat on top of. I hope when you read about the women in Exodus 1, the midwives, Moses' mother and sister, Pharaoh's daughter, that you see them as the resistance that they were. And I hope you see what their stories say about the God of Israel, that he sees the marginalized inside empires, that he weaves redemption through the most unlikely and unconventional people, that he is not impressed with pharaohs and gods and kings when there's a midwife being faithful in the back room. And I hope when you read about Jesus' family fleeing to Egypt, you no longer picture some empty countryside, but rather a thriving diasporic community that had been there for centuries, ready to take in another refugee family from up north. The pharaohs built to be remembered, but most of those names are footnotes now, in a language that had to be translated by outsiders. Israel was trying to remember, to keep a covenant alive across generations, empires, and exile. One goal produced monuments that had to be deciphered. The other produced a story that is still being told by millions of people today. Well, that's it for the Egypt in the Bible series. The further reading plan is over on the Substack for you, you'vehearditsaid.substack.com, or you can check out the show notes for the link. I'm so excited for what's coming next. I'm wrapping up a digital companion book that will encapsulate this whole series in one place. The further reading plans, photos and insights from my trip to Egypt, and more. If you're a subscriber over on Substack, I'll be sending it out soon. And if you're not one yet, it's a great time to join. Just a quick note on what's ahead. My plan going forward is to do a larger series like Egypt in the Bible a few times a year. And in between those series, I hope you'll join me for more classic You've Heard It Said episodes, breaking down the familiar or the strange with historical and anthropological context. Speaking of strange, the next episode is one I've been itching to write. You might remember the Rebecca and the Well deep dive I did a while back. We're doing another one of those. Genesis 18, Abraham's three mysterious visitors, the meal under the oak at the Mamre, Sarah laughing behind the tent flap. I cannot get to the end of that chapter without thinking, what on earth is happening? And I would love to hear from you too. What's a passage that you've read 100 times that still feels strange? Send it my way on Substack or on the socials. Thank you again for listening. I'll see you next time.